Blacksmith Shosui Takeda-san firmly believes that the sharpest knife in the world is nothing. If you've ever seen or held one of his knives, you'll see he's not too far off from making that a reality. Most of his knives he forges just about paper thin. That's his goal, a paper thin knife. There's a lot more to it than that though. So the ultimate, most sharp knife you could possibly ever have would be impossibly hard and thin, probably made of something like diamond, and no more than a micron thick. And if you're thinking that sounds really impractical for using in the kitchen, you'd be right. Today we're gonna ground ourselves a little bit more in reality, and we're gonna talk about what makes the sharpest kitchen knife. Nerd alert! If you are looking for an actual kitchen knife, we are about to get really, really deep and nerdy, so maybe pop on down to knifewear.com to look around there. This is not like a selection video, this is like a knife geometry video. So what actually is sharpness? Sharpness is actually made out of three things. That is the material the knife is made out of, the polish of the secondary and primary bevel, and the geometry of the knife. So this little like sharpness triangle is gonna fluctuate a lot depending on what you're actually cutting. The big thing to keep in mind here is that sharpness is really relative. A knife that's good for cutting wood is not gonna be good for cutting fish, and vice versa. Obsidian, for example, was a really great material for old style arrowheads and could be chipped away because it was very brittle. But that also made it a little bit more limited use and harder to work with. That hardness of obsidian also translates into brittleness, which makes it a little bit more like glass. Razor sharp, but really easy to chip or damage. So an axe head like this is gonna be super good for splitting wood, but even if this edge was mere polished, it's super thick, so it's not gonna be any good for shaving. We're living in reality here, so we're gonna make some assumptions before we find our perfect knife. One is that we want a reasonable, workable material, so we're not gonna be making any knives out of diamonds today, unfortunately. Two is that we're gonna be using our knife to cut regular food responsibly. There's nothing crazy happening here. We're not blasting swords into airplane propellers. So let's start with material. If you've poked around our website at all, you've probably noticed that we really like Japanese steel because it gets a little bit harder. The bottom line is that harder steel holds a sharper edge for a longer amount of time. So with harder steel, you can make a blade much thinner and polish it to a lot higher degree that it'll actually hold for a longer amount of time. Whereas with softer steel, you're gonna lose that edge pretty quickly. So we especially like Japanese steel for its hardness specifically. The hardness does come with a couple of trade-offs though, because with a harder steel does mean that it can get a little bit more brittle. Not quite as brittle as glass like the obsidian that we were talking about earlier, but just something where you don't want to cut anything that you wouldn't bite through with your teeth. That means you don't want to do bones, frozen food, harder things like Parmesan rinds can actually chip the edge of your knife if there's any sort of sideways torsion. In Japan, one of the most common construction method for knives is a technique called sanmai, where there's a harder piece of steel on the inside of the knife, and then it's clad in two softer pieces of steel. Sanmai literally means 3 layers, so you're actually getting 3 different layers of steel in your knife, softer for strength and harder for a hard edge. All right, so back to our perfect, wonderful, sharp knife. The sharpest knife in theory would probably be something like Aogami Super, Shirogami No. 1, which is white carbon steel, R2, or even maybe a HAP 40. These steels should hold that fine edge for the longest. Next, what constitutes a sharp edge is the angle and the smoothness of the primary bevel and the quality of the edge itself. The theory goes that the thinner the apex of your edge, the more force gets concentrated into that point, which means your knife just glides through the food, which is why you don't need to push at all with a sharp knife. When a knife is first sharpened, the sharpener grinds away the steel on this primary bevel to create a taper down to the edge. How thin they make that bevel and how much they grind away from the edge dictates how sharp that knife will be. So a lower angle will glide smoother through denser foods, whereas a wider angle will tend to wedge. One way to get an idea of how thin the bevel is how tall the primary bevel is. You can also look down the edge of the knife, the choil, but from the side you can see about how much is ground away. A taller bevel means a narrower angle of sharpening, whereas a shorter bevel means a little bit more of a dramatic taper. That's why when you test the sharpness of the knife only by the very edge, it doesn't tell you the full story about how a knife will perform. So we want a knife that has a thin, tall bevel sharpened at a narrow angle, but not so thin that the core steel is overexposed. At the end of the day, we still need our kitchen knife to cut like a kitchen knife and not be a razor. It needs to be durable enough for daily use. Now that we've spent all this time making the perfect tall bevel that's extra thin behind the edge, just where we need it to be, it also matters how the side of the knife is polished. So you want a sweet spot. You want something a little bit below mere polish because you don't want to create a suction with your food, but you also don't want it to be so rough that it's grabbing onto your food as you slide through it. Something like a foggier Kasumi finish, or something a little bit more highly polished, but not quite to a mirror, is going to get you right where you need to be. All right, we have finally reached the actual edge of our knives. So we've got a beautifully hard knife. We have perfected the geometry of the primary bevel. We've polished the side of the primary bevel, not too much, not too little, that kind of like middle mama porridge level. So we've finally arrived at the cutting edge, which is called the MicroBevel. So like polishing the side of your knife, the edge of your knife also has a bit of a sweet spot between what is too coarse and what is a little too fine. It's a common misconception that the more you polish your knife edge, the sharper it gets, but that's actually not really the full story. So a coarse edge has the advantage of biting through rough things like tomato skins and giving you just a little bit more grippiness when you're cutting through food, whereas a finer edge, a more polished edge, can be really nice for delicate things like fish skin, but it can be so polished that it's going to glance right off tomato skins. Sometimes even when a knife is technically super sharp, it doesn't feel super sharp. So to me, the sharpest version is kind of the best of both worlds, and it's called differential grit sharpening, where we're using a little bit of a coarse grit and we're using a little bit of a fine grit. When you sharpen your knife on a stone, the stone leaves little tiny teeth in the edge of your knife. So this is going to be the micro bevel of your knife. This would leave pretty big teeth. This is kind of somewhere around a 220 or a 400 grit, something that's going to be a little bit coarser, and what I was talking about is really good for tomato skins. Whereas something finer is going to be something like a 4,000 or an 8,000, and what you can actually do is combine the two by doing one side with your 400 and one side with your 4,000, or whatever combination that feels good to you. I usually like to do about a 400 and then maybe an 8,000 on the other side. So the reason this is ideal is because you've got that 400 edge that can bite into food for you, but you also have the advantage of the 4,000 edge, which will help glide. One way to visualize this is kind of like the serrations on a shark's teeth. So the actual tooth is going to be your coarser grit, and the little serrations are going to be your finer grit. These combine to create a really, really sharp feeling knife that performs well and performs well for a long time. So this creates an edge that can both do tough things like tomato skins and bell pepper skins, but can also glide through smooth ingredients as well. So I picked out 6 of the knives that in our experience have felt mostly the sharpest to us. Of course, with any Japanese knife, they're all going to be super, super sharp, but if you're looking for something with that extra tall bevel, these are great. This guy is the Yoshimi Kato SG2 Black Damascus. It is super, super thin. It's very smooth feeling, and it's got a nice and tall bevel that, although there isn't a defined line, it's got a very nice taper. This guy is the Kurosaki Senko. This one is made also out of SG2, and Kurosaki really needs no introduction, but this knife is the perfect balance of that polished bevel. This is the legendary Koutetsu. Many knife collectors feel that this is the sharpest knife in their collection, and that was Shibata's goal when he started making these knives. These are forged by Takeda. They are made of R2 steel and ultra, ultra thin. These 3 knives are all on the ultra thin side. They all perform like lasers, and the next 3 I've got are a little bit thicker at the spine, but all have really nice tapers, and that extra weight makes them feel like they fall right through your food. This guy is the Hado Ginsan. If you want a knife that's a little bit more durable but still has that ultra sharp feel, this is a great place to start. I have a lot of love for this knife. One of my favorite things about it is how clean the shinogi line is, which is the line right at the top of the primary bevel. It takes an incredible amount of skill for sharpener Maruyama-san to get that line so perfectly straight. Also from Hado is the Hado Sumi line. This one has a super fun feature where this already tall bevel gets even taller near the tip of the knife. We'll talk about that in a second. This last one is a staff and customer favorite. This is the Masakage Koishi. This one has ultra hard aogami core steel clad in stainless, so it's nice and easy to take care of. Super tall bevel, so you still get that really sharp feel. And this one is also differentially sharpened on the edge right out of the box. So at the end of the day, absolutes are fun. They're reassuring and kind of sexy in a weird way, and I would love to tell you that there's exactly one legendary knife out there, the sharpest ever made, definitively, ultimately, and tested against all others, but that's just kind of not really how it works. The honest truth is that the sharpest knife really depends on the job it's built for. For our purposes today, for somebody who has a reasonable knowledge of how to use a knife, the sharpest knife is going to be something with pretty high hardness, so kind of 65 to 66 on the Rockwell hardness scale. It's going to have polish somewhere between a little bit coarser and a mirror on the primary bevel, and it's going to be differentially sharpened. For a little bit of extra spice, maybe it would have Naoto's 4D sharpening technique along the way. And if that means absolutely nothing to you, that is totally fine, and pretty much any Japanese knife you pick is going to be great. But for me, and for my purposes, that looks a lot like these guys. What do you think? What's your sharpest knife? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to know more about sharpening techniques, check out Naoto's sharpening playlist.